Now, get into the Saul effect now, because I'm going to tell you this. When Jesus was on this earth, and we are supposed to follow him, Jesus never encouraged people he was ministering to or preaching to look in the direction ever of the occult, to read books about it, to go to magicians and learn about it, to go to diviners and learn about it. He never encouraged you to dabble in such things. You know why? Because when you lay your eyes on it and you start reading into it, it gets into your spirit and it starts to anchor in your soul. And once you begin to become obsessed and spend more time researching and talking about the occult than you do Almighty God, the occult already has you. They've already got you. You're already giving them free advertising. Not only free advertising, but they've already got a hook in your life. They've already got it. If this is what you're obsessing about, reading about, speaking about a lot, accusing about, the occult's already got you. Because that's how they work. And I thought for the record, I would say that. Now, the Saul effect. This is something the Lord gave me actually, I don't know, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago now. What is the Saul effect? The Saul effect, and we get this from 1 Samuel, okay? But the Lord to me called it the Saul effect. Why? Because an effect is something that happens from what you do, cause and effect. There is a cause and there is an effect that happens from it, right? So when Saul took his eyes off God and started putting his focus and energy into slandering, harming, and wanting to mortally wound David, his reputation, his life started to spiral in a tailspin. He became erratic in his thinking. He became tormented. He became bitter, jealous, and angry in his speech, in his actions, and against those around him that didn't agree with him, okay? There were those around him that were feeding that. Now, listen what I'm about to say. There were those around Saul that were feeding the bitterness, jealousy, anger, and paranoia to try to profit off of Saul, to try to get ahead in their positions. They did that. Now, Saul in his flesh began utilizing resources. His platform as king, his friends, paid employees, in an effort to take down David and try by his own hand to secure the kingdom for himself and his bloodline. Okay? He painted David as evil, as ungodly, as dangerous, as against the king and the kingdom. He manipulated and gossiped. He manipulated the people into turning against David. Now, there was a loyal group to David that saw right through Saul. But in the kingdom was divided in a way. And he manipulated people into turning against David and believing this was not a man of God, when indeed David was anointed of God to do a task. He was anointed of God for a purpose. Purpose may have been a little different from Saul, even though they were both going to be king over Israel. Their purposes were a little different, though. This is when the tormenting spirit was sent to afflict Saul. Saul was more concerned about himself, his reputation, power, than what God wanted him to do. He became obsessed with everything David did. He became obsessed with pursuing David at all costs. Now, those around Saul with a pure heart and a level head could see clearly that Saul was venturing further and further away from God, that he was going after somebody that was righteous, and he had lied to himself and convinced himself they were unrighteous because of things that have transpired. Saul has killed his thousands and David his tens of thousands. It all started when Saul was too chicken to deal with Goliath. And the Lord sent a brazen shepherd boy named David in to do what Saul should have done. Okay, this is when this started. Saul became delusional. He entered very dangerous territory before God, because rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft, and we're going to see that in a minute, trying to smear and harm David. Saul's own son, Jonathan, even opposed him in this and didn't agree with what he was doing. So instead of being king and carrying out his commission God gave him and allowing the Lord to prepare David for his commission, Saul became a stumbling block to the whole nation. Now, when you take your eyes off of what God is doing with you, okay, the commission you've been given, and your focus off of the lane he gave you to stay in, and you start veering into other lanes, and you put your anger, frustration, focus, energy into being in an unhealthy way, concerned about what someone else is doing, how the Lord may be utilizing someone else, preparing them, using them in a way different than you. When you walk into a bitter judgment where you are willing to twist everything and twist it up to make it look a certain way and lie and threaten and manipulate because of the issues that were never resolved in Saul, right? If a person does this, they are doing what Saul did, and they have entered into the Saul effect. And the Saul effect is a very slippery slope. It's a very slippery slope of confusing, illogical ideas, condemnation, anger, obsessiveness, frustration, accusation. It is a very slippery slope. And Saul made this mistake. The Lord had two different purposes for Saul and David, but the problem was Saul was not maturing in his purpose the way David was maturing, okay? Saul, at the age of what? 40, 50, was still not there in his faith that David was at in his teens when he killed Goliath. Think about that one. Saul had been king all those years and stagnated in his faith, and a brazen teenager had more faith in God than that man in his 50s did, okay? Or however Saul was 40 or 50 years old. Now, the issue becomes that Saul went from this humble beginning of looking for his father's donkey and finding Samuel to this, because he got corrupted by power, by notoriety. He then thought he could just off David and get rid of David because David was deemed a threat. The problem is that Saul strayed so much from God. What happened? His next stop was the witch of Endor, right? The slippery slope of accusation and bitterness and anger. And his next stop was the witch of Endor. Rebellion is as the sin of witchcraft. Where rebellion is present, witchcraft is there somewhere. It's in the mix, okay? Derek Prince even says this. He's got amazing teachings, Derek Prince. If rebellion is present, witchcraft is present. And Saul had entered full rebellion. And he went to the witch of Endor and consulted with a woman that had familiar spirits. There are people out there who have the witch of Endor running in their circle that they've already consulted with, and they don't even realize it. And they will after it's too late. And after Saul consulted with the witch of Endor and took part in that horrible ceremony, now let me tell you something in the word. There's only one animal that is mentioned that the witch of Endor had, and it was a fattened calf. Why a fattened calf? Fattened calves were used for huge celebrations and to solidify ceremonies. Once she killed that fattened calf and her and Saul ate together after she called up whatever that was that acted like Samuel, they solidified that horrific divination, dark ceremony, okay? And Saul, that was the end of Saul. Saul, in battle, fell on his own sword. He was wounded, and then he fell on his own sword. So the Saul effect is very dangerous. It's dangerous when people enter it because it is a very sharp downhill slope and it's not pleasant. And Saul could have repented. Saul could have repented. And he didn't. He chose to keep doing what he was doing. And that's sad, because Saul could have repented, finished off as an incredible king, and handed everything off to David. He let a lot of things enter into his house that had no business being there. And he took his eyes off God, and he put him on destroying David. And that was what was sown in his own life. And this is why the Saul effect is so dangerous.